Hello, everyone. If you haven't gotten the chance to watch the video on the syllabus, please go back and watch that so that you can become exposed to, what this class entails, the assignments that are coming up, and, my expectations of you, your expectations of me, how to reach me, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, if you haven't gotten the chance to watch it yet, go back, give that a watch. It's a pretty quick watch and come back here. So today we're going to be talking about defining a miscarriage of justice. This is going to be a broad lecture. It's going to be a quick lecture. I'm basically quickly going over everything that we're going to be discussing within the scope of the next 5 weeks. Now, in the article that I provided, Garner defines a miscarriage of justice as a grossly unfair outcome in a judicial proceeding. And this definition's expansive, right? So it's not just what happens at the end. It's not just, incarceration or conviction or this person has to pay a fine, blah, blah, blah. It is also non-conviction related issues. So everything that happened to get to that point, every point where a miscarriage of justice occurred that led to that outcome, right? But in order to start understanding what may occur, what mistakes may occur, what remedies we can install in place, we have to understand the three components of the criminal legal system. And those components are law enforcement, courts, and corrections. Now, thinking about them, let's think about it as an individual getting arrested, right? An individual comes in contact with law enforcement. And in this instance, we're talking about police departments, sheriff's offices, federal agencies, and their primary functions are investigating crimes, gathering evidence, apprehending suspects, right? Think about an individual who's getting arrested. They come in contact with law enforcement. Law enforcement in that instance will carry out ideally their role, their responsibilities, and that person is found guilty and there's enough evidence to take them to court. So we transition into the courts, right? And their role in this instance is adjudicating criminal cases, right? We're focusing on criminal cases. We're not really discussing civil cases or anything else that is outside of the scope of criminal cases. And the key players in the court that we're concerned with are judges, they are prosecutors, they're defense attorneys, they're juries, right? Each of which functions within the court system and each of which can have a hand in a miscarriage of justice. So our hypothetical individual goes to court, they go through the arraignment process, they go through the adjudication process, they are found guilty of whatever crime it may be, right? And then they're sent to prison or jail, or they are decreed to parole or probation, whatever it may be. Our corrections branch of the criminal legal system entails supervision and rehabilitation of convicted individuals. And ultimately, depending on your philosophical outlook, right, the goals of this branch of the criminal legal system can be punishment, they can be societal protection, they can be retribution, right, vengeance, rehabilitation, whatever they may be. And I know for a lot of folks watching this may be a review and it may be something that you've been exposed to many times, but we just want it to be front and center as we kind of develop this conversation, right? So when we're talking about types of miscarriages of justice, we're talking about wrongful arrests, we're talking about wrongful charges, indictments, wrongful sentences. We're talking about harassment by law enforcement. We're talking about attorney failures to perform, and we're talking about correctional failures. Now, there are other ways that miscarriages of justice may manifest, but these are kind of the top ways that we are going to be exploring. Now, in order to understand the way that miscarriages of justice may happen, the potential for miscarriage of justice to occur at each stage of the criminal legal system, we have to understand a concept called discretion. And now I know again that this is a review for many of you, just in case, and just so that we have it, clearly conceptualized. What is discretion? right? And we want to think about discretion. Let's contextualize it within this class, right? Let's say 5 weeks from now, I enter final grades and you, the viewer, get an 88.9, right? And you send me an email or you come to office hours and you say, hey, would you mind rounding it up, right? And in that instance, I have the discretion to round up your grade or to keep it as is. Each decision will impact you or impact your GPA, right? So thinking about having the power, having the responsibility, having the discretion to make a decision that impacts an individual's life. So for example, a cop's decision to arrest or not to arrest, a judge's decision to push for a minimum sentence or push for a maximum sentence, a prosecutor recommending a maximum sentence, or et cetera, et cetera. Those are some examples of discretion in the criminal legal system. If we understand discretion correctly, then we understand that there is a potential for miscarriages at each stage of the arrest, adjudication, and correctional process. Cool? This would be the time I would ask for questions, but we're obviously speaking into a void. Now, there are two types of errors in miscarriage of justice that we're concerned with, and these errors were brought up in the article that I provided. There's errors of due process and errors of impunity. Now, errors of due process have to do with the Bill of Rights. Now, the US was founded on this principle that people should be protected against an intrusive government. What does that mean? The Bill of Rights delineates these protections, right? It delineates the protections of you will not be subjected to unreasonable search and seizure. You will not be subjected to unwarranted interrogations. You will not be subjected to punishment without the right to a trial by a jury of peers. You will not be subjected to invasions of life, of liberty, or property, right? So this is what we mean by errors of due process. Are these fundamental rights being undermined or being ignored or etc.? And errors of impunity, on the other hand, now this could get a little convoluted hearing it for the first time, but bear with me. And if there are any questions, please reach out, right? So when we're talking about errors of impunity, we're talking about a type 1 error and a type 2 error, right? A type 1 error, which we call a miscarriage of justice, and it is the more severe kind of error, is falsely identifying culpability. So falsely finding a person guilty when they are in fact innocent. And this is what we call a false positive. Whereas an error of impunity would be a type 2 error and is the less severe error. And that is failing to find a culpable or a guilty person guilty or a false negative, right? And we want to relate these to each component of the criminal legal system. So thinking about discretion, thinking about the decisions that are being made, thinking about the relationships within each component of the criminal legal system and how they may manifest in a type 1 error or a type 2 error. I'm not going to really be using the language of type 1 error and type 2 error, so don't worry about that, but think about the concepts of a false positive and a false negative. Falsely identifying culpability, falsely identifying guilt, or falsely identifying or failing to identify culpability or failing to identify guilt, a false negative, right? There's an obvious relationship between these two types of errors, so between an error of due process and errors of impunity, and we'll revisit this concept in the coming weeks. Now, recently in kind of layman spaces and spaces outside of the criminal legal system, people are getting interested in this concept. They're getting interested in this idea of what a miscarriage of justice is. And there are reasons for this, right? There's been a lot more scrutiny on capital punishment cases, so execution cases. There are a multitude of reasons for why people are getting more involved or getting more scrutinizing capital cases more, but that is a sort of limitation because if we compare the number of capital cases or execution cases that exist versus all sorts of other arrests or all sorts of other convictions, capital cases are much rarer, right? They're a much rarer event, and there are still miscarriages of justice occurring in this wide pool on the other end, right? So limitations, but capital cases have kind of brought this conversation into the public sphere. And public opinion has shifted. So for a while in the 90s and 80s, people didn't necessarily believe that individuals were being executed while they were innocent, but there are a lot of polls from the early 2000s that indicate that people believe otherwise. So, for example, in the 2003 Gallup poll, 73% of people that were surveyed believed that an innocent person had been executed in the past 5 years, right? CNN replicated that poll, USA Today replicated that poll, Newsweek replicated that poll, each with similar numbers resulting, right? And there are some factors that contribute to this increased awareness. And some of them have to do with how successful the true crime genre is. So it's become more accessible to the public and it's become a more accessible conversation for people. And people have more questions regarding the due process behind convictions, behind finding someone guilty or finding someone innocent. But also another reason, so true crime, the advent of DNA profiling. So our technological advances in DNA have been astounding in the recent years, and that has altered the conversation around guilt and innocence. The establishment of the Innocence Project has been wildly important, and we will be pulling documents and information from the Innocence Project throughout this class. And the National Conference on Wrongful Convictions and the Death Penalty was also incredibly vital for altering the public conversation around guilt and innocence. The Chicago Tribune investigative series was also important for changing public awareness, as well as the Illinois moratorium on capital punishment. And that last one we will be revisiting. No worries about that. So there are some, looking at it from 3,000 feet in the air, there are some reasons, like quick reasons, that we know why miscarriages of justice occur. And we'll get into the nitty gritty of it again. I keep saying that, I know, but we will be getting into more detail in the next coming weeks. So if we're thinking again about the components of the criminal legal system and thinking about the process as like, you get arrested, you go to court, you go to corrections, etc. What happens during arrest or during contact with law enforcement that may lead to a miscarriage of justice? It includes shoddy investigations, misconduct during investigations, improper interrogation techniques, right? When I say shoddy investigations, that may also include mishandling of evidence, mishandling of legal procedures, etc. So that may occur, and then we move on to courts, and we move on to the court system where we have issues with witnesses, we have issues with eyewitness misidentification, we have perjury, we have prosecutorial misconduct, judicial misconduct or judicial error, so errors by the judge, ineffective assistance of counsel, so your defense attorney not doing their job, and jury selection problems or juror misconduct, so issues with the jury. And then we have correction. So the person gets incarcerated, they get convicted, whatever it may be, but we have failures to release inmates when sentences expire, we have inadequate rehabilitation programs, and we have parole and probation violations, right? Due to systemic issues. So we will be discussing gender and race and class in more detail as we go on. And very quickly, there are ways that we can solve some of these issues. So enhanced training programs for law enforcement, improved evidence handling procedures, better interrogation protocols, and within the court, improving legal representation, reforming eyewitness identification procedures, strengthening forensic practices, and addressing prosecutorial and judicial conduct, right, in very clear ways. And when we're talking about enhancing corrections, we're talking about improving rehabilitation programs, enhancing oversight of release procedures, and reforming parole and probation practices. Now, there's still a lot of work to go on how we would even begin to confront miscarriages of justice within the criminal legal system. But for now, this is all you need to know. Once again, we talked about the components of the criminal legal system. We talked about discretion. We talked about errors in due process. We talked about errors of impunity. And we talked about some of the ways that miscarriages of justice manifest in law enforcement, courts, and corrections. We talked about some of the possible remedies or some of the possible solutions that we can cultivate or create in order to start addressing miscarriages of justice. And once again, your assignment is twofold, right? It's a choose your own adventure. So after you watch this video, after you do your reading, you're going to go in and you're going to have the opportunity to either do a short quiz, a 10-question quiz based on this lecture, or to answer a short essay question. Literally 500 to 700 words, very short. And that's it, right? Each week, you choose your own adventure. Around week 3, we start discussing our final essay. But for now, you choose your own adventure, either assessment through a quiz or assessment through a short essay. If there are questions, comments, concerns, please reach out through email or through Canvas. I am happy to answer any questions. See you guys in the next video.